Over the years, the World Bank has come to recognize the potential importance of extractives for development. As the world looks beyond fossil fuels, the World Bank too is having to adapt. We talked to Christopher Sheldon, who leads their work on extractives. Christopher, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, it's a real pleasure to be here.
You lead the bank's agenda on extractives. Let me ask you a very direct question. Are the extractives good or bad for development?
Well, I think they're good for development. That's why I work in the sector. But there's a lot of ongoing negative impacts that need to be really well managed environmentally, but also socially. So for me, the answer is yes, but it depends a lot how you go about managing the sector. And that's why I think it's important to actively manage the sector, not just sort of let it happen.
When you look at extractives from an economic or a global economic point of view, there seems to be two conflicting groups. You have, on the one hand, community consumers who benefit from low commodity prices, and then you have commodity producers who benefit from high commodity prices. How do you solve this conundrum?
Prices go up and down, so there's always sort of temporary winners and losers in that process. And usually those things come to somewhat of an equilibrium over time, where there's the right supply of minerals that we need, but at prices that allow governments and communities to get good benefits and companies to get a good return is the right balance. That's pretty difficult to achieve, but over cyclical nature of the industry, I think that's what happens.
There are people now that are predicting a downturn in the economy. How do you see that will affect the industry?
Yeah, I know the World Bank and IMF recently sort of revised their global economic outlook with a slightly lower growth forecast. So I think that does have an impact on demand for commodities. But overall, what we've seen is that there's a fairly robust demand for minerals. It's changing a little bit.
So you mean changing which commodities are in demand?
Certain commodities are in demand. So I do think that we are going to see a shift. What the World Bank's own view on this is that we'll have a transition in the types of minerals that are important to the world. So we'll see commodity prices rise in some of those and perhaps fall in others. The way we look at it, and from the research we've done, is that the world of the future, a lower carbon world, is much more mineral intensive than the world of today. So over time, we think that indicates that prices would be robust over the longer term, but there'll always be some fluctuations. Certainly the slight slowdown in the growth of China, who's been a big driver in demand for commodities, that has an impact. But we're seeing growth in other places, and so I think that serves well for the mining industry and for the countries that have those minerals.
I want to dig a little bit deeper into the energy transition, moving away from fossil fuels. What do you do when it comes to energy transition?
The World Bank has a target for what we call climate co-benefits. And so for my department, which is energy and extractives, we want 70% of our lending to have climate co-benefits. That means that it should do something positive for the climate, if I can put it like that. So that's a real focus for us. So on the energy side, and I manage the extractives, but there's a strong link, of course, to energy.
Right.
There's a big focus on renewable energy, on energy efficiency. We still also do other things, transmission lines, sector reforms, other things that are not tied directly to that. When it comes to the mining sector, we're really trying to see how we can bring in renewable energy into the mining areas. There's a lot of mines out there that are fairly remote. They run off diesel generators because that's independent and fairly reliable for the company. But what if the fact that there's a mine there allowed us, or even better if there's maybe 2 or 3 mines, allowed us to have an independent power producer come in and build a hydro electric scheme that would service all 3 mines, but another 200,000 people that live in the area. So we would not necessarily have the resources to just come and build that, but if we can leverage the demand from those mines, we can bring in energy there that can benefit not just those mines, but a lot of other people. It's been about 4 or 5 years since we did a real detailed study on that called Power of the Mine, and we looked at Africa and we modeled that in different countries, and you can have cleaner, cheaper energy that services the mines and also then can power all the communities around there. That's easier said than done in practice, but we're also trying the same sort of thing with solar power to try to have that in remote areas that would help power a mine, but also feed in then to the grid around those mines. So we're trying to integrate that even directly into the mining sector work, but I think there's a long way to go there, to be honest. I think that's an area where also the industry is really looking hard. How do they lower their carbon footprint? How do they save money on power? But they need to make sure they have reliable power, and that so we would need to work together. I think this is a good example of where governments and private sector and development partners like the World Bank can really work together to try to bring those sorts of solutions.
And they're also walking away from coal.
Yeah, so we haven't financed coal since 2010.
Exactly what I was
we
going
have
to get to.
have a fairly strict policy on coal, and we are unlikely to ever be financing that again. And I don't see that happening in the future at all. So we have a much bigger push, on cleaner energy. In fact, just recently we launched a special campaign on battery storage. We're actually raising $1 billion to put towards battery storage, because we think that's one of the obstacles, for wide scale sort of solar and wind is the lack of storage. So if we can actually crack that and bring in more battery storage and help lower the prices of that, that will really help accelerate the use of those renewable energies globally. So that's another big push of ours. But that also brings you back to the minerals side, because you need minerals for those batteries. So it kind of comes back into what I started talking about earlier, the role that developing countries have in providing the minerals that go into these sorts of technologies.
Tell me about the concept climate smart mining.
Yes, that's a real new thrust of ours. It comes from a couple of different sides. We know that more minerals are needed for clean energy technologies. We want to make sure that the right supply of minerals is there, so that there's no hindrance really in the adoption of those technologies. And technologies change, and the kind of minerals that go into those technologies will also change. So we can't exactly predict everything that will happen and which minerals will be used. But overall, despite whatever technology changes are there, it's clear to us that you'll need a lot more minerals than you need today. So that's the first part. But we also want to make sure developing countries have access to those markets and can participate in supplying that. There have been concerns raised from some manufacturers about the source of their minerals, and we don't want developing countries to miss out on the opportunities because there's concerns that those sources of minerals are, for example, involving child labour or environmental impacts that are negative. So we want to help countries address those sorts of issues so that they are seen as responsible suppliers of the minerals. But there's also then the carbon intensity of manufacturing minerals themselves. That's something that hasn't been a lot of attention paid to. But if you take a car today, most of the emissions come from the fuel. But if you have an electric car, well, most of the emissions will come from mining the materials that go into making the car. So then it starts to raise questions about, well, how green is the supply of those minerals? So we also want to play a role in lowering the carbon footprint of the mining process. We'd love to partner with industry in doing that. Industry meaning the mining industry, the auto industry, the tech industry, because we think that's important for the planet. If we're going to be producing the amount of minerals that we think are needed, we also need to lower the carbon intensity of that production. So we want to learn from the innovation that's happening. We'd like to make sure that innovation is shared so that other companies can adopt those same sort of approaches. And for our work with the governments, we'd like to develop the right kind of policies that will encourage that sort of behaviour. So climate smart mining sort of encompasses all of that. It's the impact on forests of mining and trying to minimise that, the use of water in mining, the sources of energy that go into mining. All of that is all part of climate smart mining for us. So in a nutshell, it's, I would say, making sure that the right minerals are produced that the world needs, but in a more sustainable way. I sort of call it, and I think the job of the World Bank in mining is really about resources for a sustainable future.
Let me just tie it back to what you were talking about in the beginning, about volatility and the difficulties of managing that for governments. And some people say that with, for example, lithium, there might be even more volatility and more difficult to manage. How do you prepare government, or how do you help governments be prepared for that?
No, that's a very good question, and that's sort of why you might have heard me sort of hesitate on, sort of hedge a little bit on the types of minerals, because lithium, for sure, at the moment,
Yes.
everybody's excited about lithium because of battery storage for vehicles and for the power sector. Our own report I talked about the role of minerals in low carbon economy predicted 1,000% increase in the use of lithium, and that was probably an underestimate because we think that market will actually grow. But technology could change and it could be a different structure. So that's a tough one, but that's true for all sorts of commodities. There's ways for governments to help manage volatility. Sovereign wealth funds, for example, putting aside money from the good times for the bad times. I also think having a diversified mineral sector, or more importantly, a diversified economy, is important for managing volatility. So I think all of those things are things that governments should be doing, not just putting everything behind one technology or one type of commodity. In the past, people were looking for copper and gold, but now I find that the government's saying, hey, I've got graphite, or I've got lithium, or I've got rare earths. So there's a lot more interest in a wider variety of minerals, and countries are realizing that they have all of those minerals. So it's not just large-scale bulk mining, it can be more niche mining. And all of those sorts of parts of the sector are important, and that adds to some diversification. But in terms of a broader diversification of the economy, you want to take that money from the times that are good and invest it back into human capital, invest it back into infrastructure, because if things change, you want to have some lasting benefits from the use of the resources.
Opportunities and challenges as always.
Yes.
Thank you very much for joining us today.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure. Thank you.